I walked into that restaurant ready for war. Divorce papers in my purse, lawyer on speed dial, and a heart full of rage. But when he opened his mouth, the words that came out weren't what I expected. They weren't even close. What he said changed everything I thought I knew. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, if you've ever prepared for the worst conversation of your life, stay with me. This story will show you that sometimes the truth is more complicated than we want to believe. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will make you question everything. My name is Rachel, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. I thought I knew what he'd done to me, to us, to our marriage of 7 years. I was so sure, so certain of his betrayal, that I'd already started dividing up our furniture in my head. But sitting across from him in that quiet corner booth at Romano's, I realized I didn't know anything at all. Let me take you back to where this all started. Tom and I met in college. He was studying engineering. I was working toward my teaching degree. We were those couple that everyone said would make it. You know the type, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at inside jokes, planning our future like we were reading from the same script. We got married 2 years after graduation in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. Nothing fancy, but it felt perfect. It felt real. For the first 5 years, we were happy. Really happy. We bought our first house together, adopted a dog named Charlie, and fell into this comfortable rhythm of life. Tom worked at a construction firm, and I taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. We had dinner together most nights, watched movies on weekends, and talked about having kids someday. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. But then something started to change. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you notice but tell yourself you're imagining. Tom began working late more often. He'd come home after 9, sometimes after 10, looking exhausted and distant. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me these short, vague answers. It was fine. Just busy. That was it. No stories about his coworkers, no complaints about difficult clients, none of the usual details that couples share. Then came the phone calls. He'd step outside to answer them, or he'd take them in the garage where he thought I couldn't hear. I'd catch fragments of conversation through the walls. "I can't talk right now," he'd say, his voice low and urgent. "We'll figure this out later." When I asked who was calling so late, he'd brush it off. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was because he wouldn't tell me. The worst part was how he started pulling away from me physically. We'd always been affectionate people. Tom was the kind of husband who'd hug me from behind while I was making coffee in the morning, or reach for my hand during movies. But suddenly, there was this invisible wall between us. He'd come to bed after I was already asleep, and he'd leave before I woke up. When I tried to initiate intimacy, he'd make excuses. He was tired. He had an early meeting. His back was bothering him. I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. Tom said he was working late again, but when I drove past his office building around 8 o'clock, the parking lot was empty. His truck wasn't there. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, calling his phone over and over, but he didn't answer. He finally came home at 11:30, claiming he'd been at the office the whole time. When I told him I'd driven by and seen the empty parking lot, he got defensive, angry even. "You're checking up on me now?" he said, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "What's next, Rachel? Are you going to follow me around like some kind of detective?" That's when I knew, or at least, that's when I thought I knew. He was having an affair. All the signs were there. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the emotional distance, the lies about where he'd been. It all made perfect sense, and it broke my heart into a million pieces. I confronted him the next morning. I stood in our kitchen, still in my pajamas, and I asked him directly, "Are you seeing someone else?" The look on his face. I'll never forget it. It wasn't guilt, like I expected. It was something else. Something that looked almost like relief, but also fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. "Rachel, he started, then stopped. "I can't do this right now. I have to go to work." And he left. Just like that, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving me standing there with my question hanging in the air between us. That was the last real conversation we had for 3 months. That evening, he packed a bag and went to stay at his brother's place. He said he needed space to think. I said I needed space to breathe. We were both right, but for all the wrong reasons. Over the next few weeks, I did what any betrayed wife would do. I looked for evidence. I went through his browser history, his credit card statements, anything I could find that might give me answers. And I found things. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Late-night trips to places across town. Cash withdrawals that he couldn't explain. Every piece of evidence confirmed what I already believed, that my husband was living a double life. I called a lawyer. Her name was Mrs. Peterson, and she was exactly what you'd expect from a divorce attorney. Sharp, no nonsense, expensive. She listened to my story with the kind of professional sympathy that probably came from hearing similar tales every day. She asked about our assets, our debts, whether we had children. She explained how property division worked in our state, what I could expect in terms of spousal support, how long the whole process might take. "The most important thing," she said, sliding a business card across her desk, "is documenting everything. Every suspicious behavior, every lie, every piece of evidence you find. The more proof you have of his infidelity, the better your position will be." So that's what I did. I became a detective in my own marriage, collecting evidence against the man I'd once promised to love until death do us part. I screenshotted text messages, photographed credit card statements, even drove by that office building again to confirm when he wasn't where he said he'd be. My sister helped me organize everything into a folder that grew thicker by the week. My friends took turns listening to me vent, offering tissues and wine and promises that I was better off without him. "You deserve so much better than this," my best friend Katie said one evening as we sat on my couch surrounded by legal documents. "He's a coward for not even having the guts to admit what he's doing." And I agreed with her. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious. But underneath all of that anger was something else, a deep, aching sadness that I tried not to think about. Because as much as I hated what Tom had done, I still loved who he used to be. I missed the man who used to make me laugh, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, who would sing off key in the shower and make me smile even on my worst days. After 2 months of separation, Mrs. Peterson suggested we arrange a meeting. "It's time to make this official," she said. "Get him to sign the papers and start moving forward with your life." I called Tom's number for the first time in weeks. He answered on the second ring, and hearing his voice made my chest tight with emotions I didn't want to feel. "Rachel?" He sounded surprised, maybe hopeful. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the divorce. About making this official." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "Okay. Where do you want to meet?" I chose Romano's because it was neutral territory. It was the kind of family restaurant where we'd never been together, where there weren't any memories to complicate things. Plus, it was public enough that we'd both have to keep our voices down, which seemed important given how our last real conversation had ended. The week leading up to our meeting was torture. I practiced what I was going to say, how I was going to present the evidence, how I was going to maintain my dignity while confronting him about his betrayal. I imagined different scenarios. Him denying everything, him finally admitting the truth, him begging for forgiveness that I wasn't sure I could give. I prepared for all of it, or at least I thought I did. The night before our meeting, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, my bed now, I kept reminding myself, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. I was going to see my husband for the first time in months. I was going to hand him divorce papers and officially end our marriage. I was going to look him in the eye and tell him that I knew what he'd done, that I had proof, that it was over. I felt like I was preparing for battle. The next morning, I got dressed carefully. I wanted to look strong, confident, like someone who had moved on. I chose my favorite black dress, the one that made me feel powerful, and I did my makeup more carefully than I had in months. I wanted him to see what he was losing, to regret what he'd thrown away for whatever cheap thrill he'd been chasing. I arrived at Romano's 15 minutes early and asked for a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. I ordered coffee and tried to calm my nerves while I waited. My purse sat beside me, heavy with the weight of divorce papers and evidence folders. My phone was charged and ready in case I needed to call Mrs. Peterson or Katie for support. When Tom walked through the door, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his 32 years. His hair was longer than usual, and he was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt that he would normally never leave the house in. He looked exhausted, and for just a moment I felt a flicker of concern before I remembered why we were there. He spotted me and walked over, his steps hesitant. When he reached the table, he stood there for a moment like he wasn't sure if he should sit down or run away. "Hi, Rachel," he said quietly. "Tom." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down." He did, and we stared at each other across the small table. Up close, he looked even worse. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. Not guilt, exactly, but something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. "You look good," he said after a moment. "Don't." I held up my hand. "We're not doing small talk. We both know why we're here." He nodded and looked down at his hands. "The divorce. The divorce." I reached into my purse and pulled out the papers, setting them on the table between us. "Mrs. Peterson drew these up. Everything's pretty straightforward. We divide the assets, you keep your truck, I keep the house, and we both move on with our lives." Tom stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "Rachel, Before you say anything," I interrupted, pulling out the evidence folder. "I think you should know that I'm not stupid. I know what you've been doing. I have proof." I started laying out the credit card statements, the screenshots, all the documentation I'd been collecting for months. Late dinners at restaurants I've never been to. Cash withdrawals you can't explain. Lies about working late when your office was empty. Phone calls you wouldn't take in front of me. I kept my voice level, professional, like Mrs. Peterson had taught me. "I know about her, Tom. I know you've been cheating on me." But instead of the defensive anger I expected, instead of denials or excuses or even admissions of guilt, Tom did something I wasn't prepared for. He started to cry, not just a few tears, but real, deep sobs that shook his whole body. He put his face in his hands and cried like his heart was breaking, and for a moment I was so shocked that I forgot to be angry.